ado, I would like to introduce our very distinguished speaker of today, Professor Dr. Shlomo Shpiro. He's a director of the European Institute of the Bar-Ilan University and also an ELNET fellow. Professor Dr. Shlomo Shpiro is professor of political science and director of the European Institute at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He has researched and taught at numerous leading universities in Europe as well as in Israel. His current research project examines the military cooperation of Germany, Israel, and NATO in the context of the changing and challenging global security challenges and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Professor Shpiro is the first ELNET guest professor in Berlin. He has recently also been appointed a member of the International Commission on the 1972 Munich Olympic terror attack. And as the director of ELNET, who is dealing a lot with the EU, but also with NATO, it is my pleasure to moderate this session and to welcome you, Professor Shpiro, for this timely discussion. Before going into the question, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the paper, the policy paper that you wrote for ELNET recently on the topic of NATO, and then we can dive into the details. So I'd like to welcome you again and give you the floor to share with us a little bit about what you researched for ELNET and also what you discussed, among other things, in the parliament in Berlin with German members of parliament and my colleague Karsten Ovens. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matti. Thank you, David, for your kind words. And I would like to thank everybody for taking the time, either from your summer holidays or from your very busy schedules, for the meeting today. Second half of August is never an easy time. For those who work, they'd like to be on holiday. Some of those who are on holiday would like to be back at work already. But here we are, and I thank both of you for giving me the honor and the pleasure of addressing such a distinguished audience. And I would like to talk today about something which I researched, but also feel very strongly about over the past 25 years, which is the relations between NATO and Israel. We all know NATO, and we know that NATO is the biggest military alliance in the world. We know Israel. Israel has also a large military, but for many years there were no real connections with them. And I will say now just a few minutes about the paper that I just published. It's available for all of you on the ELNET Berlin website. I would like to just mention a few brief policy points and some of my recommendations, and then we can go into the discussion. Basically, when I started working in Brussels on NATO and on NATO-Israeli relations in the second half of the 1990s, many people used to say, what do they have to do with each other? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a military partnership which was constructed in the early stages of the Cold War to secure Western Europe from the Russian or Soviet invasion, headed by the United States, Canada, and of course Western European allies. What does Israel have to do with all of that? I will try to convince you that there is a lot to do with NATO and Israel, and that we should see and hear more about this in the future. Basically, we have, on the one hand, Israel, which is a military power, a regional military power in the Middle East, and we have NATO, which is the regional military power in Western and Central Europe. There is a lot in common. In the past, during the Cold War, what was in common was a kind of common enemy. The enemy of NATO were the Russians. The enemy of Israel in those days were the large Arab states, which were armed and funded and given the weapons by the Soviets. And so we had a situation in which both Israel and NATO armies were facing with enemies using the same weapons. So the Russians, the Eastern Europeans, and the Arab states, the Egyptians, the Syrians, and so on, were receiving their weapons from the Soviet Union. And therefore, the earliest cooperation between NATO and Israel was how to counter these weapons. It was almost taken for granted that Russia in Europe and the Arab countries in the Middle East will always have a numerical superiority. The Egyptians and Syrians would always have more tanks than the Israelis. The Russians would always have more tanks than Western European countries. So how do you create one tank to counter 10? How do you create one plane to stop 10? And so on and so forth. And this numbers game was the initial interest or initiative from NATO to cooperate with Israel during the Cold War. And the way they did that was to try and learn from the military lessons of the various Israeli-Arab wars, the conflicts, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and the First Lebanon War in 1982. In all of these wars, the Israeli army was fighting Soviet weaponry, missiles, tanks, planes, radars, what have you, and found ways to overcome this numerical superiority. By the way, we see the same problem in the Ukraine now, where the Russians, in the beginning of the war, had a huge numerical superiority over the Ukrainians. Something like 12,000 tanks to less than 2,000 of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't have a decent air force. The Russians have the world's largest air force. And the Ukrainians had to find a way of turning this numerical superiority of the Russians to disadvantage of the Russians, which they did very well. And so the earlier relations between Israel and NATO were all about weapon systems, were all about technological developments. And behind the scenes, there was a lot of cooperation between Israel and NATO, learning the lessons from various wars and trying to plan one war ahead. It was said in the past that the French army was always planning to fight the previous war. That's why they failed in World War II. They were planning to fight the weapons of World War I. NATO and Israel were always trying to fight at least one, if not two wars in advance, because you never know what kind of technological developments are going to affect the battlefield. And so we come to the 1990s with a lot of hidden background of technological military cooperation between NATO countries and Israel, but nothing politically overtly in the open. And this all changed in 1994 after the Oslo Accords. NATO felt that it was no longer just a purely Western European organization, that it had a global role to play. If we go back to that time, NATO was very active in the former Yugoslavia. Of course, in the past 2 decades, it was active in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Africa, and other places. So part of this transition of NATO from being a purely European organization to a global player, they felt they had to make way for closer cooperation with Israel on the one hand, but on the other hand, they had to remain, or they felt they had to remain politically correct and not get too close to Israel and worsen their relations with the Arab countries. And so they came up in 1994 with a typical NATO solution, which is called the Mediterranean Dialogue. They took a bunch of 7 countries together, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and even Mauritania, and said, well, we're going to have a dialogue between NATO and these 7 countries, but these 7 countries together. So this is not a bilateral dialogue with each country, but a very strange construction of having NATO on the one side and all these 7 countries on the other. Well, you don't need a PhD in security science to understand that these countries of the Mediterranean dialogue have very little, if no interest, security interests together. I mean, what do you have in common between the Mauritanian army or the Moroccan army and the Israeli army? And there are countries who wouldn't sit with Israel in any case, like Algeria, Tunisia, and at that time, Morocco as well. And so the Mediterranean dialogue was on paper a great political initiative of NATO, but very quickly it got stuck, it was bogged down, And today, almost 30 years of Mediterranean dialogue are not going anywhere. There are annual meetings and there are annual plans and there are great declaratory statements, but behind the scenes, there's almost nothing done on the level of these 7 countries together. And over the years, because the Mediterranean dialogue doesn't really function, but NATO wants relations with Israel, they moved to a structure. The Mediterranean dialogue was called NATO +7, NATO and the 7 countries. They now moved to a structure called NATO +1, which is direct relations with Israel. Still, much is done behind the scenes, but more and more is done in front of the cameras. And we see in recent years a lot of things like joint trainings, Israeli forces participating in NATO training, not only in the Mediterranean, but also in Europe itself. NATO forces coming to Israel to train together, and more recently, learning the lessons together from the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And in my paper, I pointed to 3, there are many more, but to 3 lessons which Israel and NATO are analyzing together from the Ukraine war. The first lesson is that air power does not win wars. Unfortunately, in Israel, we thought that it would. In the Second Lebanon War, almost 20 years ago, in 2006, the Israeli army thought that only with its air force it could beat the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that failed. The Russians made the same mistake a year and a half ago when they invaded Ukraine. They counted on their air force to really make a difference. Unfortunately, or fortunately for the Ukrainians and for us, it doesn't work this way. So we are in an era in which we are going back to old-fashioned large-scale wars. People thought that this era was gone. People were concentrated, military experts and armies were concentrated on counterterrorism. The last 2 decades, since 9/11, we had the wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Africa, and so on. These were not major engagements. These were small-scale counter-terrorism operations. We're now going back to the type of massive-scale war that a lot of European armies kind of forgot about. The second is the issue of civilian areas as battlefronts and missile defense. And sadly, we see almost every day how the Russians are attacking Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian infrastructure with heavy casualties. And if this sort of warfare will happen in other countries in Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, or somewhere else, we're losing the distinction between the traditional battle front area and the rear area where civilians are. And that is why the issue of missile defense is becoming so important. And as David mentioned, it's undoubtedly a historical moment last week when the German government decided to buy an Israeli missile defense system, which is called the Arrow 3. Look at how history moved in 75 years. And now it's the Israelis who are providing the systems for the protection of Germany and of Western Europe. And the last, and I don't want to get too much into it, but I will mention the role of unmanned and autonomous weapon systems. We see the role of drones, and we see the role of other unmanned types of weapon systems. This is becoming a huge thing in warfare. And today, when the price of one fighter aircraft is about $100 million, one unit, $100 million, you can buy 1,000 drones for that price and create much more damage without even risking a pilot. And we see the Ukrainians in recent months, even without any air force, they are able to inflict severe damage to the Russians, even in Moscow itself, by using drones. In the battlefield, they're using drones all the time to great success. On the other side, we see the Iranians supplying the Russians with drones because Russian drones are no good, so they need to go to the Iranians and get drones from them. They are receiving thousands, literally thousands of small drones, which they are operating in the Ukraine. And my paper goes on about the lessons from that. So I think I will stop there and say there are many fields of potential cooperation or deeper cooperation between Israel and NATO. And indeed, the title of my paper is From Cooperation to Partnership, because the type of cooperation that was going on so far is very ad hoc and very kind of small scale. I think it's time for NATO to take the plunge, move away from this failed Mediterranean dialogue into a clear, open, constructive dialogue with Israel, which won't only be for the security of Israel, but will definitely enrich and enhance the security of Europe. Thank you, Matti.
Thank you for this very comprehensive and very interesting overview of the NATO-Israel relationship. Just before I go into my first question, I think it's also interesting to mention that ELNET organized a seminar at the NATO premises here in Brussels last year, before the summer is more exact, about the cooperation that is possible also between Israel and other countries in the context of the Abraham Accords. So we had Israel at the table, we had think tanks from Israel, think tanks from Bahrain, think tanks from Morocco, and we had very senior representation from NATO also at the table to discuss further cooperation also in this context. So just to mention that there are many things are ongoing, and there are many also initiatives that we as ELNET are supporting and pushing. But to go back to your remarks and in specific the Arrow 3 project, because what we have witnessed last week is quite extraordinary. In your policy briefing, it states that the Israeli approach to the missile defense is capable of meeting key strategic requirements of NATO. This is mainly about protecting European cities from possible Russian missile attacks and future conflict. But how do you assess the recent acquisition of the Arrow 3 anti-missile system for the German armed forces, the Bundeswehr, in this context? And could further projects of this kind also follow? What are your thoughts?
Thank you. To say it very simply and very openly, today, NATO cannot defend Western European cities from missile attacks. The systems that they have are systems for shooting down aircraft, enemy aircraft, which were developed during the Cold War. These are Patriot missiles and other types of anti-aircraft weapons. They can shoot down enemy planes, but they have very, very weak capabilities to protect European cities. On the other hand, Israel over the past 20 years developed a comprehensive system which works, which functions. And unfortunately, we see it every few months in Israel functioning on almost a daily basis, shooting down rockets from Gaza or from Lebanon. In order to understand the Arrow 3 system, we need to go back to the 1991 Gulf War. And those of you who remember the name Saddam Hussein, was the president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who occupied Kuwait back in 1990. And once a war broke out and the Americans were attempting to liberate Kuwait, he said he's going to eradicate Israel by firing Scud missiles with chemical weapons and biological weapons and what have you on Israel. And I remember very well the first night of the Gulf War back in '91, sitting in bunkers with gas masks on because Israel was being was being attacked by Iraqi missiles from about 800 kilometers away, and there was nothing to shoot them down except American Patriot missiles, which didn't do a good job. And we were sitting with gas masks because we didn't know whether these were going to be chemical weapon missiles. We know that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons because he has used them against the Kurds in northern Iraq, with thousands of people being killed. Luckily, he did not fire any chemical weapons at Israel, but he did fire 17 large missiles, which hit Tel Aviv, Haifa, Ramat Gan, and other places. And after that war, the Israeli government said, well, we can't count on anybody else. We have to provide our own missile defense. The impetus for missile defense became even stronger with the ongoing Iranian nuclear program. Now, the Iraqis are about 800 kilometers away. The Iranians are closer to 2,000 kilometers away. So you had to have a system which could, first of all, detect missiles being fired 2,000 kilometers away, very, very difficult, and then you have to shoot them down. The Iron Dome system, which was developed to shoot down rockets from Gaza, can hit rockets at ranges of about 60, 70, 80 kilometers. You needed to do something which would work at 10 and 20 times the ranges of that. Now, missiles coming in from Iran would go into space. So they would be fired in Iran, they would go into space and then land in Israel. And so you have to shoot them about 100 kilometers over the earth. You have to, if any of you remember the space wars of President Reagan, he had the idea to shoot down incoming Soviet missiles, but those would go from the Soviet Union to the United States, and the US would have 20 or 30 minutes advance warning on that. Israel has about 6 to 7 minutes of warning missiles coming in from Iran, and you have to have a system which would be so fast that the Iranian missile would be fired from one direction, the Israeli missile fired at the other, and they have to hit together somewhere in space. And that's just about like me, throwing a marble, you standing a mile away from me, throwing another marble in the air, and they have to hit each other. When the system was in its early stages of development, people said, this is not going to work. This is space fiction. You cannot fire a missile that would exactly hit a missile, each of them running at thousands of kilometers an hour at a height of 100 kilometers above the earth. It just wouldn't work. Well, the bottom line is that it does. It works, and it works quite well. Israel has a anti-missile system, which is based on 3 tiers of missiles. You have the Iron Dome for short-range missiles. David Sling is for medium-range missiles, let's say about 300 kilometers, and then the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 system for anything up to 2,400 kilometers away. And so the Europeans decided that they need a similar or an identical system in order to counter the threat of Russian missiles on their cities. And I'll leave this by saying that where are the actual Arrow missiles made? Well, a great part of them is made in North Carolina. This is a joint US-Israeli project. Much of the actual production takes place in the US. And by the way, that is why the approval of the US administration was needed. And it was given last week, last Wednesday, for the deal, because this has always been a joint Israeli-US project, which will now protect Europe. The amazing thing is, and the Europeans were absolutely surprised. Normally, when you order a system like this, you get it in 10 years, if you're lucky, because it needs development and testing and this and that. And the Israeli aircraft industries, which make the Arrow system, they said, well, you could have it next year because it's fully tested. All we have to do is give you the missile launchers, a number of missiles which are in stock, so that European cities could be covered very quickly.
Thank you. So this also again highlights the strong transatlantic element that is involved in all of these developments. In recent days, the European Sky Shield initiative has also been gaining momentum. Even neutral countries like Austria, Switzerland want to join this initiative. Can the project close gaps in NATO's protective umbrella over Europe? And how can Israel be involved here beyond the delivery of weapons technologies?
Well, the European Sky Shields initiative is hampered by technological competition between France and Israel. The French, who are a major player in the EU and to some extent in NATO, want the Europeans to buy French missiles. The problem is that many Europeans are not convinced that the French missiles, which have never really been tested in battle, provide a good enough solution as the Israeli missiles. And that is why Germany decided to put its money where its mouth is and buy the Israeli system, not because they're doing Israel any favors, but because over a prolonged testing phase, they came to the conclusion that this system, A, works, and B, provides them with real protection for their cities. And I've just seen the recent German governmental papers coming out over the weekend that they will place the Arrow missiles in 3 bases, one of them to the east of Berlin, one in Bavaria, and one in the north of Germany, in order to protect major German cities. Countries like Austria and Switzerland and other NATO member states, they're torn at the moment between buying Israeli weapons and buying French weapons. Buying a French weapon is not just a military question, it's a question of employment in France, it's a question of political influence of the French within the EU. And so I think there is a political problem here, not just a military one. If you take on different and conflicting weapon systems, they will not necessarily work in tandem together. You don't want to have a situation in which a missile fired against France will get one response and a missile fired against Germany get a different response. I think at the end of the day, it will be a political compromise that would incorporate some type of French-made weapons as well, and they can certainly be, they can be on board this project as well. But I think the Israeli Arrow system is already providing 80% of what the Europeans need. And if the French feel very strongly about it, I think they can even be, in my opinion, brought into the Arrow project as partners, or perhaps part of the European side could be manufactured in France. It's up to the experts and to the politicians, not to the generals, to iron out the details here.
Yes, and in this case also meet the challenges of the policies of protectionism that sometimes come to the forefront in Europe when Europe is challenged on economic or research fields. Before I ask you the next question, I would like to remind everyone that we can or that you can pose your questions in the chat, and that we will get back to you when we will finish this this part of the session. But just to use the most of the time, I will pose another question relating to the drones, something you already mentioned in the introduction you made. An area which Israel is also leading. In 2021, the US, French, British, Italian, and the Bundeswehr soldiers trained in the use of drones with the IDF as part of the 10-day Blue Guardian exercise. In addition, German soldiers have already been training on the Chiron TP in Israel since 2019. What could further projects of this kind look like? How could existing ones also be possibly expanded?
Thank you, Marty. In trying to answer this question, which is extremely important for the future of warfare, I want to tell you a little anecdote. I think it was about 4.5 years ago on Israel's Independence Day, just before the corona broke out. I was in Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, where every year on the eve of Independence Day, there is a big ceremony with bands and with exchange of flags and so on and so forth, and fireworks. But instead of fireworks, they had on that year little drones with lights on them, tiny little drones. Nothing special. You can buy them in every shop around your corner for a few $100s. The amazing thing was, and I was completely flabbergasted, to see 400 or 500 drones move in complete unison and move in the sky and make different shapes all together without crashing into each other, with absolute control. And this type of technology, which we call swarms of drones, is one of the keys to warfare in the future. We see what a single drone can do. And the Ukrainians were able to drop one armed drone on the roof of the Kremlin when President Putin was inside. Now, Putin was probably sitting at his desk and thinking, well, the war is very far from me, almost 1,000 kilometers away from me. I can hit the Ukrainians, they can't hit me. And suddenly there was a great big explosion and parts of his roof came down. He wasn't hurt, but I think his pride was hurt very much. And in recent weeks, we have seen drone attacks on high-rise buildings and on infrastructure targets in Russia, even in Moscow itself. By the way, the way the Ukrainians are doing it, and I'm not telling any secrets here, they cannot fly these little drones from the Ukraine. It's too far away. So they just hide them in a truck, and they drive the truck relatively close to the target, and then the drones fly off. The biggest problem of manned aircraft are the people, the pilots. They take years to train and millions of dollars, and the planes itself are extremely expensive. Air power is the most expensive part of every modern army nowadays. But we see more and more replacement of these very expensive aircraft with very small drones who can do the work excellently. I'll just mention a couple of Israeli covert operations, which Israel didn't take the responsibility for, dropping armed drones on facilities of the Iranian nuclear military program. And obviously, again, these drones didn't fly from Israel. It's much too far away. I bet you the Iranians are working very hard to try and discover where these drones came from. Drones are small, they are cheap, and very importantly, they can be easily thrown away. If they crash, if they run out of power, you can use them as weapons. They're so easy to manufacture. You have as many of them as you need. Yes, definitely, this is a field that there is closer cooperation with NATO and Israel about. And many countries realize that they cannot afford anymore to buy a large number of modern fighter and bomber planes. In the future, most of them will be replaced by drones and by swarms of drones working together. Imagine you have say, an Iranian nuclear facility that is protected by missiles against aircraft. And they have in a battery usually 8 or 16 missiles. They have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 batteries. So they got 40 or 50 missiles. What are they going to do if they're attacked by 400 drones? Well, they may shoot down 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100. It doesn't matter. The others will get through. So this is the type of threats that we're going to see more prevalent in air power. And now is the time to think and plan about them.
Thank you, Professor. I still have some questions, but I also want to leave time to our audience to ask questions to you directly. This briefing is really extremely interesting. So thank you for that and sharing your knowledge with us. But let me just finish with a very practical question, because as I mentioned in the beginning, you are a guest professor in our office in Berlin. You are very much involved in the policy work we are doing, are an ELNET fellow, if I may describe it like that. So also me in Brussels, I'm very proud of that, and I think it is really excellent, and the work you are doing with the team in Berlin. So maybe may I conclude for now with what you can say about the work of ELNET, as have you have seen it until now while working with us, and the importance of the things that we're doing also in this context of NATO and beyond.
Thank you. I have to be honest, I didn't know much about ELNET until about 3 years ago. I was aware of the existence of ELNET and some of its work, but I wasn't very familiar with its work. And during the first year of Corona, we at the European Institute at Bar-Ilan University, we work very closely with European research institutes. And Corona came, so we couldn't go anywhere. So everything became digital. And through that, I became acquainted with the head of ELNET's Berlin office, Carsten Ovens. And I took a closer look and a closer interest at what he and his people were doing. And I came up with the idea of establishing a guest professorship at the ELNET headquarters in Berlin, because there is a lot of academic exchange of experts between Israel and the US, but very little between Israel and Europe, especially in the field of security. Israeli professors and Israeli experts, they go to the US regularly and come back, and there is a very good exchange of knowledge and information, but not so with Europe. And so I thought it might be a good idea to have a guest professorship, and I actually volunteered to come to Berlin for a year and be the first guest professor. And I must say the work that your guys are doing in Europe is amazing. You don't need compliments from me, but I think I am in a position to say it very objectively. ELNET can and does many things that Israel in a formal way cannot, and Israeli embassies cannot, because embassies and ministries have to work in a very, very strict, formalized way of foreign policy. And ELNET goes to people directly. I'll just give you one example. Once I've written my paper on NATO, ELNET organized at the blink of an eye a briefing at the German parliament, inside the parliament, with dozens of members from the various parties who came because they were interested, not because they wanted to help Israel in any way, shape, or form, but because they were interested in how do we enhance the security of Europe? What can we take away from the Israeli experience that is relevant for us? And that's just one example. And they wouldn't let me leave. We had to. We did two events. It was on Thursday and then on Friday, because the parliamentarians wanted to send their experts the next day to write down things and discuss things of a more technological nature. So this is just one example that ELNET can do and does all the time. The Israeli embassy could never have done such a briefing because this would be meddling in political issues of the EU and of Germany. So I'm very happy to and very honored to be an ELNET fellow. And you guys are doing amazing work, which needs to be done, absolutely. And everyone who supports you is part of that. It may sound very naive, but I have the highest appreciation of everyone in the room now, because I was told all of these are friends of ELNET and supporters of ELNET, so you all have a part of it.
Thank you very much for this answer. I couldn't agree more.